On the 200th episode of Perils for Pedestrians, we talk with Apollo 12 astronaut Alan Bean about walking on the moon. Then we talk with Space Shuttle astronauts about walking in space. Finally, we look back at some of our favorite interviews. Stay tuned.
But I can walk quite well.
We're at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., talking with Alan Bean. What was it like walking on the moon?
Well, if the suit didn't leak and it just stuck together like it did for all the missions, we knew it would, but still, things can happen, then it's safer than walking on the streets of a big city. You haven't got these big trucks and cars coming by that could lose control or not see and give you a big bump that might end your life. So as long as your equipment worked, it was a lot of fun. The thing that I noticed running on the moon, it tends to be easier to run than it is to walk because you can get kind of bouncing along. And if we look at the TV of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon, we see them not walk much. We see them bouncing around. It turned out to be easier to do that using your ankles and not bending your hips and knees quite as much. And so I think that if you wanted to run a marathon, for example, it'd be easier to run it on the moon. Because I can remember pushing off the moon for my next step, and before I touched down on my next step, I would feel the muscle in the other leg relax, the calf muscle. And I'd say, it's resting here. I can feel it resting even before I land on the other leg. So I felt like I could run a marathon and be rested. I sure wouldn't want to try running a marathon at my age here on Earth.
And you had a couple people walk there before. Had they told you enough that you knew what to expect when you got there, or was it still a bit of a surprise when you actually were out there on your own for the first time?
No, I think the training beforehand, underwater, in the 0G or 16G airplane, or some of these other devices that would sort of give us 16G, having all that training allowed us to be feeling fairly much at home. We took 2 or 3 minutes to get your balance. You had to sort of hang on and then let go and then try to let your legs pay attention to just being this light. And when you were used to it after a minute or two, human beings adapt very fast. We adapted and it worked okay after that. So I think that they told us things, but I think the training itself was the thing beforehand that made it seem familiar. And, of course, that's the object of training, to make things not unfamiliar.
And you've had an interest in painting, and you've had experience in space. Where did the idea come from to combine the two?
Well, my hobby, even before I was selected as an astronaut, was art. When I was a test pilot, I enrolled in night school up at St. Mary's College near the Naval Air Test Center in Maryland for drawing and watercolor. And then through the years, when I was an astronaut, when there was time, which wasn't often, I would enroll in the Museum of Fine Arts Night School or take from some accomplished artists in the neighborhood. So it was just something that I liked doing. I never imagined that I would do it for a profession.
How'd you get started, switching careers like that?
Well, when I came back from the moon, I continued to paint earthly scenes because that's what instructors taught you. And my astronaut friends kept saying, "Why do you do that, Bean? Why don't you paint the moon? You're the only artist in all of history that's ever been anywhere but the Earth. You need to quit painting the Earth and paint this other place that no artist has ever been, ever." And I did, it was hard for me to catch on to that. And finally, one weekend, I didn't have any flowers to paint or didn't want to paint a landscape. And I got out a picture I'd taken of Pete Conrad, and I started painting it. And after several hours, I said, this is what I should be doing because I know everything about the suit. I know all about the lunar module. And when you talked about flowers or something, I only knew petal and stem and root, and that was about it, But as far as space equipment, I'd spent 18 years living this and loving it. Also, it was the thing I loved. So later on, I flew Skylab 59 days. I loved doing that. I was the backup commander for ASTP, the Russian mission, first Russian mission. And finally I looked around the office and I thought, there's a lot of good young men and women here. They can fly this space shuttle as good as I can. I was training to be an early shuttle commander. And I said, I like that, but I'm the only one of the 12 of us that have been to another world and walked on it that is interested in preserving this in fine art. Maybe I should think about giving up this job I love and go do this other job, because if I leave NASA, they'll never miss me. Indeed, they haven't. But if I don't do this other job, these paintings won't exist. And that is really how it's turned out. And so I've been gone from NASA 28 years. I think I'm about Apollo all the time. I have to paint these things like this. But I think I made the right decision to leave and try to record one of these great adventures of humankind. This Apollo thing is on the level of the first trip around the Earth, or any exploration will be seen in history as equal in the same category. But now we've got these paintings that I've done in addition to the photographs and television. So that's the thinking. That was the thinking.
So how have your Apollo paintings evolved since in the time since you first started doing them?
Well, when I first began doing them 28 years ago, I was had the heart of a scientist. I think of it that way. So when I painted the moon gray, and then I would make it maybe a little greenish gray or violet gray. I painted the suits white, because that's what they are, and the shadows are gray. But maybe I would paint them a little bit purple gray or something. I couldn't do much, because if I did, I wouldn't believe it looked like the moon. And so as the years have passed, my heart has slowly changed from scientist, astronaut, to artist. And so now I can look at the moon that's gray and decide how to paint it. Do I want this to be a reddish gray? Do I want this to be a yellow? That's a beautiful color. It looks warm like it was up there. And so I'm more of an artist now, and the paintings, I believe, show that. The shadows on the suit are turquoise sometime and blue, depending on how I think I can tell the story that I try to tell and make it more beautiful. Artists are not charged with reproducing reality. We're not really charged with anything. That's one of the beautiful things about being an artist, but generally we're in charge of taking reality and making it more beautiful, more exciting, more wonderful than maybe it really was. And that's what I do now. I tell the story accurately. The hardware is very accurate, but I can change the colors. Just as Monet made grain stacks, which are dirty yellow, all of them you've ever seen and I've ever seen, but he made them red and blue and green and yellow, all these beautiful colors. They still look like grain stack, but they're much more beautiful. That's what I try to do here.
We're at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida talking with Rick Mastracchio. What is an EVA?
What is an EVA? An EVA, in layman's terms, is simply a spacewalk. We call it a spacewalk, and it makes it sound like you're going outside and walking around, but actually what you're doing is we call it translating on the structure outside the space vehicle, and we're translating with our hands. So your feet and your legs are used very little during a spacewalk. It's all translation with your hand. Your forearms and your hands are doing all the work while you're out there.
What sort of training goes into learning how to maneuver in zero G?
Yeah, there's a lot of training. Most of the training we do is done in the neutral buoyancy laboratory. It's basically a large swimming pool. The swimming pool is 200 feet long, 40 feet deep, and 100 feet wide. And what we have is the International Space Station, or a mock-up of the International Space Station, sunk in this pool. So we put on our training spacesuits, which are very much like the real ones, except they have an umbilical. And we go down there and they make us neutrally buoyant. They make us so we don't float to the top and we don't sink to the bottom. They use a series of weights and foam blocks to get us neutrally buoyant. And from that point, we basically execute the whole spacewalk while we're in the pool. We egress the airlock. We go outside. We turn the bolts and with the wrenches, and we keep all the tools on our mini workstation that we call it. And we basically execute the whole spacewalk in that neutral buoyancy laboratory. And we practice that on a ratio usually about 5 or 6 to 1. What that means is For every spacewalk we do, we practice it 5 or 6 times in the swimming pool. Some of the other training we have is we have a virtual reality trainer. We put on a helmet and we put on gloves, and we enter this virtual reality world, and basically you're in 0G on board the International Space Station, or I should say outside the International Space Station. And that allows us to practice different things translation-wise and other things that we can't do in the swimming pool.
When you actually get up in orbit, how similar is the real thing to all the practice?
It's actually quite a bit different. The way you train in the swimming pool is you're in water. The water creates a lot of drag. As you're translating around, the water's actually resisting and holding you back, and it takes a lot of energy to translate around in the swimming pool. But it also keeps you very stable when you're in the swimming pool. You don't have to spend a lot of time correcting your body orientation, and which is just the opposite when you're in space. When you're in space, obviously there's nothing to slow you down. Once you just put in any little input in your body, just keeps on going. So it's much easier to translate, but then it's also much harder in orbit to keep yourself stable, because every little input just causes you to move in some orientation that maybe you don't want to move. So it's a lot harder to stay stable in orbit than it is in the NBL. But the tasks that you do, the turning of the wrenches, the replacing the different boxes that you're going to replace, those are all pretty much identical.
I'm a pedestrian down near the beach and I hear the sirens go off. What should I do?
The instructions for that are in the front of all the Oahu phone books and other counties as well, Maui and Kauai and the Big Island. The basic thing that you need to remember to do is just to move out of the way. The impact of the tsunami is going to be only in the coastal regions, and so for the most part you can just walk uphill to get out of the way. One of the things we always preach here, though, is for a local earthquake, one in which you felt very strongly and almost shook you off your balance, is that you need to move very quickly upslope, because that means you're only a few miles from the earthquake, and these tsunamis can move hundreds of miles per hour toward the coast. So you need to get out of the way in a hurry.
How have shoes changed over the centuries?
Well, for a lot. I have some examples. What we want to talk about mostly, when you get to the 18th century, you're dealing with a shoe the way we think of shoes nowadays. So we have a heel, which is standard on both men's and women's shoes, but a higher heel on women's shoes than you have on men's shoes. Women's shoes in the early 18th century, if you lived in the continent, had very tall, thin heels. If you lived in England, they were definitely a shorter, thicker, squatter heel. And both of those heels represent the type of lifestyles that these women were accustomed to. In the continent, you lived in the city for most of the season, and you went to the country for a vacation. In England, you lived in the country for most of the season, and you went to the city for a short time. So their environment is more gravel roads and muddy back lanes, so they need a good, sensible shoe with a good, sturdy heel. The continental European woman, it's terrazzo floors and marbles and coaches, so you can go with a really high, thin heel.
When do you expect to finally open it then?
We're hoping to open it in late September. We want to get the curb repaired. We want to put paint on the rails to keep the children away from the lead-based paint. And then we want to put a fence up. We have those 3 projects, pretty big projects when you talk about doing it over a mile span. And then we will open the bridge, and then we will work on doing the amenities in phase 2.
Lots been going on here today. What's been happening?
Well, for one thing, I've been worked almost to death, but I've enjoyed it. What we've had here today is a bike rodeo and traffic safety festival. It was a result of a partnership with the Department of Motor Vehicles and the grassroots organizations such as ours. This is the first festival of its type in this community, and as well as this is the first grant to be given to a grassroots organization in the state of Virginia, and we're rather proud of that. And this today has been a family event. Where families can meet together and kids can have a good time and learn about traffic safety, learn about public safety. It was a great way to bring the private sector together, the public sector together. I think we've just had a great time today.
A week ago, and it's still difficult to get around?
Yes, because what street crews often do, they push all the snow to the sides. That buries the curb cut, so I can't find them, even though I've lived here for some time. And then what happens when people shovel a whole bunch of snow, they only leave a footpath for pedestrians, but not someone who uses a wheelchair.
Your new sidewalks look a little different from your old sidewalks. What happened?
Well, that is correct, John. Prior to 1996, when we passed a sidewalk ordinance in the city of Fayetteville that requires sidewalks to be built at 2% above the curb and continuous through all driveways, makes a continuous walking path for the pedestrian, just like our street is a continuous driving path for the automobile. Prior to that, sidewalks were built to the individual lot, whatever their elevation was, and typically the sidewalk was cut off at the driveway on each side, and the pedestrian had to walk at whatever cross slope or elevation that existed through that driveway. So now we have a uniform, continuous sidewalk that is much more user-friendly.
What are the considerations when you're building a path, relatively close to a active rail line?
One of the main considerations is distance or separation from the railroad tracks themselves. This was a very narrow corridor. We don't have a lot of right-of-way, and we are hemmed in by the river on one side and steep banks and industrial uses on the other side. So in order to use the right-of-way we had, we did have to locate the trail fairly close to the railroad tracks. We set an internal standard that we felt if the edge of the trail was 10 feet from the edge of the tracks, that would be safe for the type of rail service that we anticipate on this. We don't anticipate anything more than freight trains at the present time or very slow-speed excursion trains, probably going a maximum of 25 miles an hour. So we felt, given the type of rail service, that as long as we had some separation from the tracks, we would be fine. The other thing we have ballast separating the tracks from the trail. The ballast is a much less attractive surface, certainly to bicyclists, but even to walkers. It's not comfortable to walk on, and that alone certainly seems to discourage people from wanting to wander off the trail up onto the tracks.
What are you folks doing today?
Well, we've set up a crosswalk enforcement detail, and we're at the intersection of George Avenue and Noyes Drive. We picked a location because of its proximity. Certainly, it's a marked crosswalk. It's an uncontrolled crosswalk as far as a traffic signal, and it's an area that we've had a lot of complaints. As you can see across the intersection, there's a synagogue, and a lot of the folks that worship there walk to the synagogue Friday nights and then again Saturday mornings. And it also is on one of the major arterials leading into the central business district, so we do get a lot of pedestrian traffic heading toward the metro station. It's a street that has a speed limit of 35 miles an hour, but as you see, as you stand here today, just by the rush of cars going by, the speeds are greatly in excess of that 35 at times. So it's kind of a two-pronged attack. We're targeting vehicles that aren't yielding to pedestrians in the crosswalk, and today the pedestrians are actually police officers wearing orange shirts, and we're also doing speed enforcement in either direction, north and southbound in Georgia, for those vehicles that are exceeding the posted 35-mile-an-hour limit.
What did you bring with you to the Nordic Roads Conference?
Well, my task is to set up a track where you can study how it is in practical to be a wheelchair user or using a blind stick.
And what are some of the obstacles that a wheelchair user would face?
One is, for instance, different elevations. They cannot be too steep. Another one is roadworks. So they become an obstacle. People dig up holes in the pavements and in the roads. And also open gutters can be very hard to cross for a wheelchair.
Are there advantages to having a separate department doing the public toilets as opposed to having it as part of Public Works or some other department?
Yeah, I think because as we work only on the issue of public toilets, we commit ourselves much more than another department which just does it aside. It's our only business, and I think the results are visible. And if top council is committed, director is committed, management is committed, also the workers are committed. We give an example and they follow, and I think from top to bottom commitment is high, and that's why we have good results on public toilets here in Switzerland or in Zurich.
Now we're along a state highway here. What problems does that present for the community?
Well, as you can see, we have heavy trucking traffic. Our town is split in half by the highway. Most of the recreational facilities, the tribal government, the school are on the west side of the highway. Most of the housing's on the east side of the highway. So in order for our young people or our elders to get to the senior center, they have to cross this busy highway.
Okay. We have a lot of interchanges around nowadays with all their limited access highways. Is this a common problem, getting across high-speed entry and exit ramps?
Absolutely. I mean, a large part of the Raleigh Beltline, I-440, a lot of that was designed starting in the 1960s. And at that time, there was obviously, it was on the fringe of Raleigh at that point, and there was not a lot of consideration given to facilitating pedestrians at that time. Over the most recent years, we've done a lot to try and improve the situation, and we're finding that it's a little bit difficult to retrofit some of those interchanges. A lot of them were designed with just no thoughts for pedestrians in mind, so to go back and do the modifications to the interchanges, it's a little bit tricky and sometimes a little bit expensive. This was the first. I mean, this is, for us, it was a major proof of concept. We had a lot of resistance from NCDOT to make any modifications to the interchange. Now that it's on the ground and functioning and functioning safely, we have done one or two other interchanges so far. We have several more on tap, so it's something that we look at as a responsibility to go back and take care of every time.
Now, what's happened in the decades since the original Woodrow Wilson Bridge was built that didn't have a pedestrian and bicycle facility, and now when you include it in a bridge like this?
Well, it's a great question, because at one point when the project was in cost trouble, when the cost estimates were higher than anticipated, we had people trying to value engineer the trail connection out. And to their credit, the governors of Maryland and Virginia refused to do that. And as a matter of course, all of our projects now have those kind of connections wherever we can possibly make them. And in fact, Governor O'Malley signed a bill the other day for the Transportation Authority facilities in Maryland that when we replace the Governor Nice Bridge, for example, that it will have hiker-biker facilities. A big step forward.
How bad are the obstacles on sidewalks in a city like Paris?
In the city like Paris, we have 2 or 3 main obstacles. We have bikes and motorbikes, which find better the sidewalk to circulate, and they are a danger and a source of uncomfort for the pedestrians. And with other obstacles, which are sidewalk cafes, which are garbage cans, which are all the things that people put on the sidewalks, and which are not really useful and which are uncomfortable and maybe dangerous for pedestrians.
When you have someone concerned about, a zebra crossing or whatever, and they haven't dealt much with government before, what sort of mistakes do you find people tend to make that you can help with your advice?
That's a very good question. It's quite often that people see something unacceptable in their neighborhood. They start working on it. They start writing letters to the authorities. But then there are 2 things that happen. First of all, they often put all their frustration in that letter. And that's generally spoken not the most efficient way to get to a solution. And secondly, they write a letter, they get an answer back, which is not very clear whether the answer yes or no, and then nothing happens, and then people finally are totally down, they don't do anything, and then they get really kind of a negative spiral. So basically what we do is on first place, the original letter. Let it be positive. Say from guys, I mean, you're doing a few good things in the community here, but by the way, let's look at that point and can you take care of this or that? And then we support them in being consistent and persistent also. So from when they get an answer that they follow up after a few weeks and say, hey guys, you said you were going to look into that. Did you look into that? What happened? So that always this kind of their action comes on top of the pile again so that they keep working on it.
How many steps did you find?
There are 734 different sets of steps, about 45,000 steps in all.
Why does Pittsburgh have so many steps?
Well, Pittsburgh was the steel city, and the prime land for the steel mills, because of the transportation on the water, was along the river edges. So all the river edges were where the steel mills were, and the workers lived in the hills. And so steps were built for the workers to get to work.
What sort of things would be in a waterfront master plan?
Well, I think our kind of base infrastructure, our planning principle is public access, our harbor walk system. Boston has about 47 miles of shoreline, and there's 39 miles of public access along the water's edge, available 24 hours a day, connecting neighborhoods to the beaches, the parks, water transportation. I'd say that's our core principle for waterfront planning.
What happens on Walk to School Day?
On Walk to School Day, we talk with the students about healthy choices, walking to school, and pedestrian safety, and we have all of our students, including our bus riders, walk to school.
How do you do that? How do you get the bus riders to walk to school?
We drop them off at a local community center, and our staff is so wonderful. They meet us all there, and we walk as a whole group. And we ask that parents who normally drop their students off at school to drop them off at the community center as well, so we can all walk together.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.